Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to watch a film first. So before I do the presentations of my guests, I think we better start with that, and then we can get into the full session. So I'm just going to wait for that to start. Which it might do any minute now.
In which 28 women writers, journalists, artists, scientists and entrepreneurs from across the continent share their visions for the future of Europe.
Well, thank you everybody for coming on a difficult afternoon to Segovia, and to anybody who's not here but is watching us and would like to be here. It's quite a brave action these days to leave your home, so we're very pleased to have people here in the audience. As you know, we are here to present this book and talk about this book, Europa28, Europe 28, which in itself is an optimistic title, as we're actually now down to 27, Brexit having struck one country off the list already. And in fact, one of the entertaining things about this book is the number of other exits that exist that get mentioned by different writers from around the world, which include things like Pokexit for Poland, Huxit for Hungary, and I think it was Estexit for Estonia. With us we have two of the authors. This book is 28 short essays by 28 women writers. I have to say that if you go and look at the back of this book and read through the CVs of each and every one of the writers, the book sort of suddenly feels a lot heavier by virtue of the number of prizes they've all won, which is extraordinary. So it's a very extraordinary, exceptional group of women who've joined together to write this book, to bring their ideas to a book which is actually published by the Hay Festival. There's a huge variety, obviously. We have women from every single country writing, and there's a huge variety of styles, some from the very pragmatic, shall we say, to the entirely lyrical. Anyway, I thoroughly recommend the book. It's actually quite a joy to read short pieces sometimes, and especially when they come with such a diversity of ideas and of intelligence. And here we have two of the authors. Furthest to my right is Edurne Portela, who some of you will know already as a columnist at El País, as a writer herself. She's on the radio, Radio Nacional, and other radio stations. I was very interested to see that she's also written about memory in Argentina amongst women there, which I think is a theme that we might bring into the discussion at some stage, because memory seems to be so important. Janne Teller is Danish, but also German at the same time by background. Austrian, sorry. A very well-known novelist who had the good sense to give one of her novels the title Nothing, which of course makes us all think of La Forêt, and very famously managed to get it banned, which of course is a significant achievement for any novelist. She's also a macroeconomist, so she looks at Europe not just with a novelist's view, and in fact over lunch today we were talking about how those two professions overlap. She's worked in human rights and continues to be interested in those themes. So I think I would like to start, if I may, starting over there with Edurne. Her contribution is called The Same Stone, in which she talks about Manuel Garcia, and it sort of takes us back to the memory topic. I'm not going to do a spoiler by explaining, perhaps you could explain it for us and let us know what it's about.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for everybody for being here. It's kind of strange because I don't see anybody, but I see like the white masks, right? So it's a strange feeling, kind of ominous. But in any case, I wanted to also, before I start talking about my contribution to this anthology, is to let you know for the Spanish-speaking readers that Galaxia Gutenberg has published the translation of all our texts in this anthology, and I'm sure it's around here if you are interested. And I agree that it's a wonderful book because it's amazing to see the different contributions, how different we are all, and how differently we see Europe, and we write from our own experiences, our own countries, but at the same time we have a lot in common. And one of the things that I really liked was seeing how memory, for example, is very present in most of our contributions. And mine has to do, when they asked me to think about Europe, I was thinking about the present before the COVID-19 crisis, right? And I was thinking about how the history of Europe constitutes basically our identity, right? And in that history, we have huge scars that we have to deal with. And one of them is the memory of the Holocaust, the memory of the Second World War. And in that sense, I wanted to link that collective memory to the Spanish memory of that war that has to do with our dictatorship, right? The Franco's dictatorship that ruled Spain for 40 years. And everything started with Manuel Garcia, who, of course, nobody knows except his family, of course, but the people who has walked through a street in Madrid that is Mesón de Paredes. In that street, if you look down, you see a little plaque like this big, with his name and an inscription that says deportado, right? He was a deportee in 1941, and he died in Mauthausen. So this is all, in this little stone. And this is part of a European initiative that is Stoppelstein? Yeah, the Stumbling Stones. I don't know how to pronounce it in German, but something like that, the Stoppelstein. And there are these little plaques of commemorations that are supposed to be like a stumbling stone. It's that stone that you encounter in the road or in your way and makes you stop and see what it is there. So it's this memory. And for me, that kind of commemoration, I think, is very important because it reminds us our own history, because those deportees were sent either to France or they went to France as refugees, and then they were interned there in concentration camps, and from there they were taken to Mauthausen, especially the Spanish ones, and that Franco was basically the responsible one, right? He was the one who sent these people to death in the Nazi concentration camps. But also, I think that was something that I wanted to talk about, but also another kind of memory, that is the memory of resistance. Because Manuel Garcia wasn't sent to Mauthausen because he was a Jew. He was sent because he was a political activist. He was part of the resistance to Franco. And I think that we need to remember that those victims, they were victims that ended there because of their ethnicity, but also they were victims, they ended there because of their political activism. And in that sense, I also talk about the publication in Spain of Telefónica by Ilsa Barea Cuxar, who was known in Spain because he was the wife of Arturo Barea, right? But she also was a militant and a feminist and a very important person in Europe, in Austria. I think she lived for a while. And she was known as a writer and translator, and then she ended up in London with this Spanish writer. And in that book, she also talks about, she wrote in 1939, but she talks also about that collective action that was going on in Europe, in every country in Europe, against the rise of fascism and Nazism, and how it was sort of a collective solidarity that, of course, in Spain didn't go much farther because of the dictatorship. But that is a memory that I think, when we think about Europe, we have to also think about these modes of resistance and solidarity that are very necessary now when we see again the rise of those kind of discourses of discrimination, of hate, and strong nationalisms and everything that it was going on when we all wrote these texts, right? But now with the COVID crisis, I think are even more powerful in terms of public opinion and public creation of political, political unrest. Right?
Yeah.
So that would be
is an example of a wider European solidarity in Spain, because she's by no means the only European non-Spaniard to turn up in Spain during the Civil War and support the Republic. I'm going to move on to Janne, if I can, and it would be very interesting to hear what you have to say about the stumbling stones as well afterwards. But you've written a very lovely piece about the House of Europe, an imaginary house, the house you would like Europe to be. Can you explain what that house is?
Yes. Maybe I should first say, I call the text My Dream for Europe, though before it actually had the title My European House. But then I felt it was presumptuous because, for one, it's not kind of mine, but secondly, also, I write about the Europe I dream of. It's not how it exists. But now I actually regret it. I want to go back and say, no, it is my European house, because if we say something and we imagine that this is how we want it to be, we are already on the road to making it happen. And unfortunately, that's what all the people who are tearing Europe apart right now, they're doing by claiming, and you're so right saying how important history is, they're claiming to own the European history, saying, oh, okay, we want to go back to our nations, and everything was better then, we want to quit Europe. But the thing was, nation states are still also very new in most of Europe, and things weren't better. We anyway have to cooperate, and they make all these myths that then they sell as truth. So I think what we need to do, those of us who love Europe and want Europe to stay together with all the differences, we make our own myth. We make it our house. where there's room for everybody. We put all our dreams in there, all our differences, but we can be there, and we can claim it, and we can, in a way, we can also claim history, because Europe, with all our wars, all our different, we were not always these nation states as they are now. Then it has been city-states in Italy, or Fürsten, or like princedoms in Germany, and there were much fewer people. But Europe has always been Europe. We have been together as a continent. So my dream basically is a house that accepts all the differences, that we are different. We shall not try to be the same. It's smart to have some of the same rules for trade, maybe for electricity or certain practicalities, but not culturally. And if we just all the time make sure that there is room for all those differences, so also that within each country and within each region in a country, within even each village, the decisions can be taken to maintain these differences and also to celebrate them. It's the richness of Europe that we have all these varieties within, and make that is our identity. Instead of saying, oh no, we need a common identity and everybody shall fit in. It will never work. People have to rebel against it because it feels like something that is forced upon us. So let our identity be all our varieties, but also that we respect each other for those, that we admire each other for the differences, that we are curious about them, and somehow make sure that every living person in Europe understands that they have the same value as another European person around. And one of the core concepts that I use in the text is livability. It's, I think, in a strange way, now it has come up so much during this COVID crisis, how it's this galloping capitalism that has destroyed so much of our earth and the climate and the nature, that has also sown the current crisis we are in with Corona. So it's a clear thing in a certain way, but this concept of livability that I want to go for is, it cuts through that in saying that something else is more important than economic terms. And if I may read just a short, because it explains it better than I can sit and say here. No longer is development measured in economic growth, figures or statistics, virtual or other abstruse scopes. Livability is everything's resonance. Does emotion add to the livability of one, of all, of the house, of its surroundings, of other houses, of all living beings of the planet, the universe? It is understood that no true wealth exists where poverty sprawls. No happiness is possible where misery abounds, no joy where one person wins and the many lose, where one person is considered to be worth more than another, where different rules apply to different people, whether man or woman, old or young, white or of color, single-sexed or many-sexed, or of whichever variety they may choose to be, of one or another religion or of none, one or another culture. It is understood that the freedom of one person is sacred, so that the freedom of one person extends itself as far as, yet never beyond, the mark where it infringes upon the freedom of another. So that's a little part of my house, our house.
It's a lovely house, which is also decorated very nicely when you look at the descriptions of Portuguese tiles, and this idea that Europe is also a wealth of styles and cultures that can live together.
Yeah. May I jump in on the stumbling stones now?
Yeah.
When you
Yes,
bring,
no, please do.
It was so wonderful to read how you take it on. I didn't know that in Spain they also have them. I've lived a lot in Berlin, where of course, they are in front of the houses. But as we spoke about over lunch, what is so interesting with the German ones is it's not from the state or government. It's the people living in a house who come together to pay, and they're rather expensive to put in these stones in the pavement, with the name of the person who has lived in the building, who was removed by Nazis and died through the wars, or through the Nazi crimes. So it's a very personal thing that the people who live in that building say, okay, I am celebrating, or commemorating the name of the person who lived in this house before me, person to person. And I think that's also very important for us when we now heal European history. And you talk about the Spanish history, that we accept it's not just responsibility of governments. We each can do something.
Yeah, in Spain, I don't know if the process is the same. I don't know if the people who live in that house are the ones responsible to, or the ones who have financed this. I don't think it's the same.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting because
it's a lovely idea, isn't it?
Yeah, because at the end, when you do that, you are contributing to keep that memory alive, and it's a way of, retribution, or it's a way of giving back to that community that has been persecuted and spoiled of all their goods and all their presence in those streets and those neighborhoods. So I think it's a wonderful initiative.
So it's an interesting idea. I don't know whether you know, I think I was telling you over lunch that Spain has another second historical memory, or democratic memory, I think it's being called this time, around law, which includes the idea of a certain amount of reparation for property that's been lost and things like that. And actually I find the idea of owners of a property which was lost, then coming forward and saying, well, we would like to honor the people who were there before, really rather beautiful and symbolically very healing as well. I'd like to continue a bit with the idea of memory, and especially the idea of history, which is repeated in virtually, I won't say it's there in every single one of these pieces, but it's there a lot. And one of the reasons it's there a lot is because of this basic idea that Europe, not Europe, but often we're talking about the European Union, the political construct of a European political alliance, let's say. Often everybody harks back to the Second World War, everybody harks back to the Holocaust, and everybody makes a fairly similar argument, which has been made time and time again, which is that we're here to prevent a return of what happened then. And so my question with that is whether in some way we haven't constructed something which is a sort of anti-history. In other words, rather than building a project with a positive end goal, what we're trying to do is build a project to avoid the negative outcome that happened previously. And whether or not that's a problem, whether that stops us dreaming or thinking of a new idea of Europe if we're constantly thinking about how it was before. Janne, what do you think?
Well, I do think that the founding fathers of Europe were really visionary and thought forward. I mean, in the 50s to think of a united Europe, I mean, that is pretty revolutionary, actually. The thing what we often forget in all the debates about Europe and the criticism of Europe is how amazingly successful those visions were. Yeah. And it's just we're now 70 years later. But if one looks at, the basic concepts and ideas of the founding fathers, they have been implemented. We have a successful united Europe. Yes, of course, with problems here and there, but wouldn't we have more problems if we had nation states? I believe so. And we can solve these problems. We have to face them as we are facing COVID-19. But the vision is successful. But what we need now is that is implemented. We need a new vision. And this is where I feel our current political setup just doesn't work for that, because they all have to look to their own nation states every 4 years to win the next election. So they cannot have a longer horizon. They cannot have a European horizon, because that doesn't give them votes at home, particularly now, not now with the nationalist trends. So who thinks of Europe? I mean, we have a parliament, a European Parliament, but with very little power, that may be the only ones who think that. Except if we as citizens decide to think Europe and demand Europe. And, you know, also us as writers or thinkers, but it can be any citizen, let's think Europe together and make a new vision for the next 100 years. Because that's what is needed. It's not that the old vision hasn't been successful. No, it's amazingly successful. But now we need a new vision.
Maybe as they'd say in Spanish, it's morir de éxito, to die of success. What do you think, Edurne?
For me, it's really hard to think about Europe these days with what is going on at Moria.
What say?
What is going on in Moria, in Lesbos.
Right, yeah. That's, of course, a whole discussion. Yeah.
And this is sort of paralyzing. I cannot think of a future of Europe while thousands of people are completely abandoned, are treated like animals in a European country. And the rest of Europe is doing nothing to stop that.
But that is exactly what we need a long-term vision for, to say we cannot be Fortress Europe, that all our European ideals of being equals, they fall the moment we treat people like that. But of course, since we cannot take everybody, you know, the 1 billion people in Bangladesh who would have better lives if they came, we have to think, how do we do it? We do that by making the rest of the world richer and better off, so people don't need to come to our shores. And then, I say, we cannot let people drown in the Mediterranean before our eyes. But I think we do need a vision at many levels to address it, because otherwise we sink just day by day, and then we have, and we sink, in terms of our own values, it's not...
Yeah, I think it shows, like, when you say, you know, die of success, I think this shows the failure. It's a complete failure that we are doing nothing. And when you think about long term, what do you do in the meantime with all those people there? Like, I can't think in long term while that is happening, you know? And this is non-productive at all. So you ask me, and I think I have nothing to offer, but it's not even hope.
No.
I don't even see hope when I see what is happening there.
Yeah.
You know, so for me it's paralyzing. And the fact that we have a European Parliament and they are not addressing this as a real crisis. But, you know, it's not even a crisis anymore because they have been there for more than a year. So what do we do with that? How can we think about a better Europe when we are allowing this to happen?
I do think that parliamentarians think about that. I mean, it's been discussed a lot, you know, particularly since 2015 when the big stream of refugees came. The thing is that there are such strong forces in each European country that works against, you know, a proper intake of the refugees. And some countries in Europe, like Hungary, totally close their borders to more refugees. My own country, Denmark, is not doing anything at all either. We are terrible. I just still think that doesn't take away from the basic vision of the United Europe. But the thing is then, what do we do with it? We cannot sit and be a rich tennis club. It's like a kind of a neo-colonialism to say, okay, if we are fine within Europe, we just put up enough fences or beat people so much when they come here that they won't come. We can't live like that. But I still believe one can make, you know, plans and visions for shorter and longer term. You say in the short term, you make sure people have a way of surviving, some decent, you make some systems of how many or who can we take in, who has a place to go back to and who not. And, you know, there are politicians trying to work some of this out. But the long-term vision has still to be better. It has, because it is to do, we cannot contribute to wars all over the world and selling weapons and squeezing countries financially or in other ways, because that leads to war, and that leads to more refugees. We cannot sell all our chemical garbage or electronic garbage and garbage in general to poor countries, because we pollute them, it creates more refugees. We cannot pollute the air or the seas as much as we do, because that again, climate change and raising sea levels create more refugees. And then we want to make, that doesn't work. So we have to change all our policies, because then there won't be that pressure of the refugees. So it's like I say, we need that long-term vision, but of course we need to simply have humanity first when we deal with people right here and now. And also say, there are no simple solution, but at least as long as we're alive, I think we have to try to do something.
Yeah, sometimes I feel so pessimistic that I think that when you say about this long-term vision, of course I share all of that. But when I see how Europe has developed in the last decades, that the only impulse has been economics, right? There hasn't been. If this is happening right now in Lesbos, is that we don't have a humanitarian, committed political corpus that won't allow this to happen, right? Like all the impulse has been more in terms of market, globalization, breaking down all the borders, but just to make things fluid, right? Just to make the market more fluid. And still, within Europe also, we have a huge difference between North and South. And we saw that what happened in Greece in 2008, too. So I don't think that there is a politics of solidarity within Europe between North and South. We have seen that. I don't know what is going to happen now with the current crisis. And even less with what is beyond our borders. So when I think about European companies being more responsible about, their relationship with the global South, or when I think about our governments not selling weapons to these countries, all that, I don't see that happening. I don't see that even. I can't even imagine that in the long term, and I can't even see a politics of solidarity within our own European borders. So that's why I don't know, maybe today I have a particularly pessimistic day, but I see it's so difficult.
I wonder whether, sorry, I'll come in a moment, but I just wanted to raise the idea of another broader problem or dilemma, let's call it, which also comes out in the different stories and essays in the book, which is the idea of identity. We're in the era of identity politics. Identity politics is what nationalism is about. You might also argue that identity politics is also what sort of the smaller field of, say, LGBT or other smaller areas that are coming up are also about. But we don't seem to have a European identity, or we don't seem to be able to agree on what a European identity is. Or maybe we do. I don't know. I mean, that is actually my question. Here we are, an Englishman, a Dane, a Spaniard. What do we actually have in common? What is it that makes us Europeans?
Well, for that, we always go back to, I don't know. I think we choose the easy road, right? To think about our common culture, that democracy was born in Greece, and all this kind of this narrative that I think, at least I don't connect to it. I'm not sure that I can think about European identity that really represents all of us. Like the piece you wrote, I think it was very difficult because it was a little bit against that, right? This idea of that we have a European identity and our identity is basically our difference or our differences. And especially I think that maybe because Spain has been sort of, I don't know, excluded for many years, especially during Franco's dictatorship, to this idea of European progress, and we have also felt kind of outsiders, no, in many ways. I think from the Spanish perspective, I think it's kind of forced to think about that we are part of that identity. So
because you feel that Spain hasn't been included in the definition of Europe, or you feel it's a sort of add-on that's just been chucked in at the end?
Because for me, there are
someone
so
else
many,
has defined it.
Yes, I don't know. I think it's because maybe the main narrative of European identity and culture, it has been created from other countries, right? And I think this is kind of the stereotype too, right?
Yeah.
Democracy from Greece, art and beauty from Italy, this idea, the romantic Europe from Germany, right? So we have this sort of basic ideas of what Europe is, or I don't know, German philosophy.
Yeah.
But the Spain is there, like I don't really know what will be our
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but I want to be part of it.
Yeah, how we fit into that sort of common identity that has to do with those, I think, stereotypes. So I really feel closer to what I think might be your idea of that identity, which is that difference that make us richer, and I think if we were more sympathetic and more empathic, right, with each other, will be
So Janne, do you
nice
think we need
identity.
do you think we need to have an identity? Do you think we need to have a definable European identity, something that we can say, this is what makes us European, and by extension and definition, not something else, because all identities in some way are actually built in opposition to something else that helps us define them. So
exactly.
That's a problem.
The concept of identity always ends up getting stuck with how we define what is identity, because in itself it's a static concept. And the moment, therefore, you put down these 8 things, as you mentioned, or the philosophy or whatever, you said, okay, but that country in Asia's even more philosophers than we have, or whatever. You see, it doesn't work like that. Or how we eat, then 100 years later we eat something else, or how we dress. It's, I think, the only way that makes sense of talking about identity is about values. Because if we have some values that are common in Europe, for example, the thing, if we believe everyone is equal, at least that's an ideal, that hopefully we shall strive to act believing in this ideal. But if we can have some of those ideals and say, okay, this is our core common ideals, they also become somehow part of our identity. And then each country, each region with their different can find their way of living with this, around this ideal. And we are not stuck, because any kind of descriptive definition will become like a fence that you feel like you want to jump over. And I think it's very important to not try to assimilate Europe into one, okay, Starbucks is American, but that kind of coffee mix that goes for everybody. We can have our differences, but I'm not defeatist in saying there is no European identity, and being mixed European myself, I have very little allegiance to any national identity. I don't feel that. If I could have a choice of my Danish passport to change with a European passport, I would choose any moment to have a European passport. Yeah. And there are so many millions like me across Europe. But I also know that us who are mixed, we have to respect those who have a family line from one region and feel very strongly for that. And that's important. And to get back to the history, I think one thing that we must take on in Europe is our history vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and improve that in the future. We don't have a very good record, and it undermines everything we say and do, I think. And we need to make that part of our identity, to take on the responsibility for our past also.
Okay. So this obviously is a book written by women. When we were having lunch, Janne, who hadn't had a chance to read the rest of the book, asked me, well, what did you see in it that told you that this was a book written by women? And I have to admit, beyond saying that it was quite intimate and personal in some areas, there was nothing specific that stood out to me as a unifying thing. But I think I would like to throw the question to Edurne, who has read most of it, to see what she thinks, and also to pose a provocative question. Can women rescue us from this mess, if we have it?
No, nobody can. Well, I think the issue with books like this is that, the question will be, why only women, right? Or what do these women have in common that makes sense to have this anthology? And I don't want to be essentialist. I don't want to say, well, just because we are women, we have a different vision. But I do think, reading throughout the anthology, that there is a feminist point of view. I don't know if all these women declare themselves feminists, but I do think that the way they look at the world, we look at the world, the way we interpret the world is feminist. Mm-hmm. Why do I say that? Because we are very worried about violence, and especially violence against the most vulnerable ones, be it women in some contexts or children. We are worried about the inheritance of that violence in our intimate worlds, but also in the public sphere. There is one of the texts that I was very impressed with it. Let me see if I find it quickly. She's from Estonia, and her last name is, of course, I will butcher her name because...
From Slovenia. Renata Salic.
No, Slovenia. Sorry, yeah. Slovenia. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So she's a filmmaker, and she writes this piece about a movie she wants to do that has to do with gender violence and violence against women, and she talks about how one of each 3 women in Slovenia has been raped or abused, right? And she's taking that, obsession she has for this film into the public discourse. She's talking about something that is very intimate, as an abuse, and she takes that into a preoccupation that has to do with politics and how her country also is going towards the right and the extreme right. So I think that in many of the texts, I see that. I see, and I think that is a feminist point of view, how you use your private life or intimacy to talk about something political and public. I also see that is a constant preoccupation in most of the texts about social justice, about equality, and not just for women, but for all society. So I think, I could go on and on, and I don't want to take much more time, but I do think that we all share that perspective that has to do basically with social justice and equality, and that is the impulse of feminism.
So Janne lives in London at the moment, and therefore should know more about Brexit than I do, probably. The introduction by Laura Bates mentions that 90% of the voices in Parliament talking about Brexit were men. Is this, if 90% of the voices had been women, if it had been 50%, do we feel that there could have been a different result? How should we look at something like that, interpret that sort of thing?
I think the problem with a referendum like Brexit was that there were so many interfering forces that haven't even been fully laid bare yet. So we actually don't know if it was a fair, view of people's will or not. I mean, it has come out with this Cambridge Analytica, how specifically they could target individuals through knowing their private data to swing them towards a vote, even on total lies. They knew which lies to tell individual voters to make them vote for Brexit. And when you have something going on mass scale, you tip an election or a referendum. And that has nothing to do with women or men, but really how they can manipulate the individual. And the other thing was, I mean, again, so many lies were told. What did people vote about? A lot of people didn't quite know, really. They said 350 million, or was it trillion, would go to the NHS. And just so many blatant lies. I don't think the people were given a fair vote. I think if they had been given a fair vote, I don't think there would have been a Brexit. But I'm not sure it makes a difference, women or men. Countryside or city makes bigger difference. No. City people would generally want to stay in the EU. Countryside people want to leave. And then the age difference, which is also interesting when we talk long term. If the young people had come out to vote more, it would have been Remain. Because I can't remember up to which age group, but anyway, it's really significant that all the younger people were against Brexit. And it was the old people voting for Brexit.
And unfortunately, but it's the old people who have the memory of World War II. So in theory, it ought to be the other way around. If that point is so important, and if they're the people who built Europe. After all, it's not the young, it's the older voters, and yet for some reason, of course, the British didn't build Europe. Okay.
No, but I think there's also...
So maybe that doesn't count.
There's also the psychological mechanism. I would think, at least, that Britain not having been given a very significant or determining powerful role in Europe through the years, or not having taken it on, for the people who either fought in or had family members fighting and being killed to save Europe from fascism, I mean, it's understandable if they look at the continent and say, that ungrateful lot, we don't want to have them decide about us. So, I can understand if something like that is lying in there.
Okay. Now, I'm just looking at the clock here and realizing that we're running out of time and that there are people in the audience who might like to ask questions. So I'm not entirely sure how this is working in COVID times, but my guess is there's someone out there with a microphone? Sorry? No microphone, okay. Questions to be asked in very loud voices. Y por supuesto en castellano si ustedes quieren. No veo a nadie. Vale. Okay, so I don't think we're going to have any questions from the audience.
May I pick up on a point then?
Right, well, so we're coming to a close. I think just very briefly, let's talk solutions. We think we're in a crisis. Edurne, what's your solution to our European crisis? We have to propose something. What do we propose? Don't know.
I would propose, basically what Janne wrote in her piece, which is more care, more solidarity, go back to those wonderful values that were supposed to be the beginning of this European dream. That will be, looking for social justice, for equality between North and South, have a more ecologically conscious Europe. That will be the dream, but it's not a solution, because I think there has to be a will to do that. It has to be a
Right.
will to implement that sort of politics of care. And we are now in politics or necropolitics. So it's really hard for me to offer realistic solutions. And I'm not a technocrat either, so.
But you've used a very interesting word, which is a very European word, if we think about European history, solidarity, if we think about the recent history of Europe and Poland.
That would be
and
wonderful.
the Polish trade union movement and the anti-communist movements in Poland. So are we failing on solidarity? Is solidarity, could that be our identity? Could that be the thing, Janne, that we're missing now?
It should at least be one of the things. I definitely agree on that. I also think what we should speak much more about is all the problems that are real, and they are like with refugees, with the climate and so on. And I totally agree with you, it's terrible that we're not dealing in any better way with the refugees. It's just, it wouldn't be better if we were nation states. I think it would be worse for each different countries to deal with all this. And something like climate change we can't take on. But I think actually it's time for civil disobedience in Europe. And now I'm not talking about those who demonstrate against using masks, because this is again something with the care for each other. But civil disobedience that capitalism shall rule our lives. Civil disobedience that the politicians and companies are not doing enough to save our climate. And we can't leave that to a 16-year-old schoolgirl from Sweden and her friends. I mean, it's great that they're doing what they're doing, but we need to, simply start taking decisions that change the course of Europe. And at least I feel, for me, a book like this, it doesn't change anything directly, but hopefully you plant some seeds in some of readers who then plant seeds more further out, and then it spreads. And, again, whatever the 60s were, but that sense of shared, love in wanting to have a changed world, and many changes were made, was there, and through a lot of civil disobedience. And I think we are at a time now where we can't wait. We need new civil disobedience to change Europe for the better.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Good. Well, I'd like to thank Janne and Edurne. We've got to the end of our time here. Many thanks to all of you who've come here to Segovia, to the Aula Magna, and to anyone else who's watching us through a screen somewhere. Hopefully next year normal service will be returned. In the meantime, a round of applause, please, and many thanks to Edurne and to Janne.
Thank you.
And no flowers.
Sorry?
No flowers.